Hello again, fellow rocket people. I'm James Duffy, and I am thrilled to be back with you for another build video, this time featuring the 1/45th scale Little Joe 2 kit from Estes. This kit was released in late 2015 and was the last major project released by Estes during the period they were part of the Hobbyco conglomerate before that company imploded in a nasty bankruptcy. The demise of Hobbyco led to the acquisition of Estes by the Langford family, who have been great shepherds of the company ever since. Now let's chat a little bit about the actual Little Joe 2, which was a critical, albeit little known element of Project Apollo. It was designed to test the ability of the Apollo launch escape system to safely pull a spacecraft and crew away from a malfunctioning booster, and it flew 5 times from 1963 until 1966. The Estes kit that we're about to build is a significant reimagining of a kit offered by Centauri from 1969 and which appeared in the company's catalog until 1977. It was apparently a tough kit to build properly, primarily due to the fact that the fins and some detail parts were made from some particularly fussy vacuform bits. The 2015 Estes kit that we'll be building is much more than a simple re-release. It uses a few of the original injection molded parts, such as the capsule, escape tower, and the reaction control system parts. And it also uses the same size of airframe tube. Beyond that, everything else in the box is new, and mercifully there is not a bit of vacuform plastic to be found inside, with the exception of this one body wrap. And we'll talk about how to deal with that peacefully. I confess that this reimagined Little Joe 2 kit is perhaps my favorite commercial rocket kit of all time, for a number of reasons. First, it's a scale kit, and even better than that, it's a replica of a fairly obscure element of space history, which makes it even more delightful. Next, it scratches my nostalgia itch by connecting the old Centauri kit, which I never got to build when I was younger, and ties it with my desire to build great new state-of-the-art kits. Finally, it is a very straightforward, buildable kit, and someone with even basic skills can produce a great model in less than about 15 to 20 hours of build time. We'll be deviating from the kit directions pretty significantly, starting with our very first step. Now this kit features a vacuform wrap on the lower section of the main airframe. Here's the main airframe tube. Note that it's got these spirals on it. Ideally, we want to fill these spirals with primer. Now, filling the tube spirals on the main airframe tube will be much, much easier if we do that before we apply the wrap to the airframe. We'll be using Rust-Oleum light gray auto primer to fill the spirals on the airframe tube. This is a high solids primer, which simply means that it'll fill the spiral grooves on the airframe well and relatively quickly. So how much of our tube do we prime? Well, there's a really easy way to do that, and that is to wrap the vacuform part around our airframe tube, square it up against the back edge here, and place a light pencil mark on the airframe tube up here at the top end. That will give us a point around which we can mask the tube so that we only get our primer on the upper section of the tube. Our next question then becomes, how do we extend this mark all the way around the tube, and how do we use that mark to place the tape on the tube accurately? Very simple way to do that. I'm going to use a simple piece of notebook paper and wrap it around the airframe tube. We'll line up the ends of the paper. Then I'm going to take a piece of tape and place it there. Next, I'm going to slide the notebook paper down to the mark. Then I'm going to use another piece of tape to just kind of hold everything in place right there. The next thing we'll do is use some good quality Tamiya masking tape up against the edge of the notebook paper to extend that line all the way around the tube. And there, we've extended that mask line all the way around the tube. Two more quick things to do and we'll be ready to begin spraying our primer. The first thing we're going to do is attach this plastic overspray wrap to the lower section of the tube. We don't want primer overspray on there. And to do that, I'm going to use some inexpensive masking tape that I've got right over here. While I do this, let's talk about masking tape. My rule of thumb is whenever the tape touches the model, like this yellow tape does, I use the good high quality Tamiya masking tape. If I'm attaching something to a non-visible part or to other tape, like this overspray wrap, I'll just use inexpensive off-the-shelf hardware grade tape. Now this particular tape this is a 3M tape that I get from Amazon, and it's intended for the automotive trade, the body trade. And this is kind of cool. Let me show you this real quick. This is a tape dispenser that I got from a company called Stuart McDonald, or StuMac. They are kind of like the Apogee components of the guitar making trade, and they've got all kinds of neat tools like this. Next, we're going to protect the inside of the tube, and that's real easy. Just curl up a piece of notebook paper, set it inside, and then I'm going to put a piece of tape right here. That way the primer will only go exactly where we want it. There is one other airframe tube that we can go ahead and prime at this point. This is the airframe tube for the launch escape system motor. Now conveniently, a section of BT5 tubing will sleeve cleanly into that, making for a great holding tool. Okay, we're now in my wife's horse trailer to apply the primer. I won't offer a great deal of commentary here, other than to point out that the primer is being applied in light coats with long strokes beginning and ending off of the area of application. For a more detailed recap of primer application and sanding, I encourage you to check out my previous build videos, especially the one entitled Advanced Finishing Techniques for Model Rockets. Let's begin working with the injection molded parts in the kit, starting with the fins and the simulated motor nozzles. These are probably the biggest change between the original Centuri version of the Little Joe kit and this more recent reimagined Estes version. These parts are what move the kit from a difficult to build relic to something that can be built with a much higher degree of success. We'll start with the fin components. These are very clean parts. They're not attached to a sprue or a runner, and there's nothing here that we need to clean up or sand before assembly. There's an A side and a B side. You can see the little tiny A and B on the interior surfaces of these parts. And they're pretty much impossible to assemble incorrectly. I'll fit the parts together. They are very well engineered and fit together pretty well even without adhesive. Still, we're going to be using Tamiya extra thin plastic cement to glue these together. We'll apply the adhesive to the inside of the part where it's accessible and to the outside where we can't get to the inside. The brush in the bottle is fine for this step. Do a little bit at a time. Capillary action will draw the cement into the joint. I'll put a little bit of pressure on that. You might even want to put a clamp on the tip. I'll continue my way around the part. Again, applying pressure. Again, we can use a clamp if we want to. You can also use a fine paintbrush for this step. Some people prefer that. Just go right along the joint. Again, capillary action will draw the adhesive into the joint. We'll go along the leading edge. I'll apply a bit of pressure and continue down the joint. And then finally a little bit upon the tip of the fin. These types of plastic cement work by actually melting the surface of each part. And as the solvent flashes off and evaporates, the parts actually weld or melt themselves together. I'm going to place 2 more clamps on here and then set that to the side, and we'll continue with the other 3 fins. Next, we'll do the same thing with the rocket nozzle parts. They fit together extremely well. I'll put some adhesive on the inside. In this case, the paintbrush actually makes it easier to get the glue where we want it. As I apply the adhesive, I'm just applying a bit of pressure to the part. We want the part to absorb the glue via capillary action. And then we apply the pressure just long enough so that it begins to flash off or evaporate. As you do this, make every effort to align the parts as carefully together as you can. That'll save you some sanding as we move forward. With the cement dry on our fin and nozzle assemblies, we can go ahead and sand the seams on the parts. We'll use an assortment of sanding sticks for this step. Like any sanding operation, we will begin with coarse grits and then move progressively through to finer grits. At the end, we'll be polishing the parts more than sanding. Now take care not to sand any detail away or change the shape of the parts. For instance, we don't want to flatten the leading edge of the fins. It's especially important to eliminate the seam marks on this portion of the fin assemblies. As you begin working on the nozzles, you may find it helpful to use some small metal jeweler's files or some cut down strips of sanding sticks to help get into some of the nooks and crannies on these parts. Next, we'll prime our fin and nozzle parts. Instead of the high solids primer we used for the airframe tube, we'll be using Tamiya primer for these parts. This is a low solids primer that's designed to prepare the surface for paint while preserving the detail of the parts. The nozzle assemblies can be attached to a handling stick using double-sided foam tape. To hold the fin parts for priming and paint, we can use these spiffy long tail alligator clips, which are sold at craft stores for photo displays. I think I paid about $8 for a pack of 40 of these on Amazon. You can attach the clip to one of the supports inside the root of the fin. We're back in the horse trailer to spray the primer, which again goes on in long, thin strokes. There's no need to get a cosmetically perfect finish with the primer. Just a couple of light coats are adequate. Once the primer has had a couple of hours to cure, we'll give the parts a quick light sanding with 1000 grit sanding film and then wipe them down with a tack cloth. Now a tack cloth is a piece of cheesecloth that's been impregnated with a mild adhesive. It'll grab any loose sanding dust or grit that may still be on our parts. You can pick up a pack of these inexpensively at a hardware store in the paint supplies section. It's time to paint our fins, and we're going to do something completely counterintuitive. Before we apply the silver finish, we're going to paint the fins with a black undercoat. The theory here is that undercoating a metallic finish with black will give the parts a deeper, more realistic look. I've done it enough over the years that I think it truly does make a difference. Same process in the horse trailer as before, long strokes with multiple light coats. Our rocket motor nozzle bits will be sprayed with white spray lacquer. Now this is a slightly different white shade than the finish we'll be spraying on the upper airframe section later. And the reason is that we want to break up the look with some slightly different white shades in different areas of the model. Now that our motor nozzles are cured, we can mask the lower sections of the assemblies using this 3mm tape that I sourced off of Amazon. The reason we're using such a narrow tape is that this section here is conical and we need some flex in the tape in order to persuade it around that shape. I am using magnification for this. I've got a visor on that may peek into the frame a few times. I find that magnification is absolutely essential for just about anything at this point in my modeling career. Here's the catch. I started using it because my visual acuity started to decline with age. If I'd started using it when I was younger, when I could see better, my modeling would have been so much better as a younger person. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to back this up with some wider tape. This is 6mm Tamiya tape here. I'll burnish all of this down and repeat it for the other 5 nozzles. We're back in the horse trailer to spray the dark sections of the nozzles. Now here I've chosen a dark metallic gunmetal lacquer so that we can get some contrast with the dark color that we'll be using elsewhere on the model in a bit. Note that I've placed some tissue into the open ends of the nozzles to help reduce overspray. Next, we're going to paint the interiors of the nozzles with a neutral go-away color to hide all the locator pins, ejector marks, and other visible hoo-ha. First, we'll need to mask the exterior of the nozzles. Now, we could use masking tape here, but instead we're going to use parafilm, which is a wax-based flexible film that's great for masking irregular surfaces. The catch is that this should only be used with acrylic paint. Next, we'll use the airbrush to apply the paint to the nozzle interiors. I've chosen a red-brown acrylic to simulate an ablative interior surface. Now, is this accurate? Perhaps, perhaps not, but it looks good. The paint is being applied with a single-action airbrush at about 14 pounds of pressure. We can go ahead and unmask the parts after the acrylic settles down for a few minutes. Let's go ahead and knock out the engine mount. This is being done just as described in the directions, so we won't dwell on it too much. The adhesive being used is Titebond 2, but any waterproof carpenter's glue will be fine for this step. Time to work on the injection molded capsule and tower parts. Now these are vintage parts popped out of a mold that's over a half-century old. Still, the moldings are remarkably clean. We can start by working on the parting line. Now the capsule has a notable parting line right at the widest point of the part, and that's easy to clean up with some sanding sticks. Now we need to take care that we don't damage this larger detail line just forward of the parting line. The lighter feature here is what we want to eliminate. To eliminate these parting lines, I'm going to start with coarse sanding sticks and go progressively through to finer sticks. Let's look at the rest of the tower parts here. As you open this bag, be careful. Some of the little reaction control system parts may have skittered loose. Be aware of that. What I'd like to do here is separate the tower lattice parts from the sprue. What we can do next is clean up the parting lines on the sides of these parts using our sanding sticks. Be aware that these are very delicate parts, so be gentle. Our tower and RCS parts are now trimmed, sanded, and prepped for assembly. I've placed all of the very tiny RCS bits, that's an acronym for Reaction Control System, into an empty paint jar so they don't go missing. We'll start with the launch escape system lattice, and I am going to make a very specific glue recommendation. Instead of the Tamiya thin cement that we've used up to this point, we'll be using something called Plastruct Plastic Weld. This is a more aggressive cement. It literally melts the plastic and fuses it, and it's ideally suited to a structure such as our tower lattice assembly. We have 2 lattice uprights, those are the longer pieces, and 2 side pieces, those are the shorter pieces. We also have the circular support element that will be glued into place. To assemble the lattice, what we're going to do is position a side piece against an upright, and then we are going to glue those contact points, there are 4 of them on each side, one at a time. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're using our Plastruct Plastic Weld cement. We'll hold this first contact point in place for just a moment. Notice that the X-shaped bits face inward. Okay, that's enough on that one. Let's do our second contact point. I'll just hit it with some cement and let capillary action draw that in. Then apply a little bit of pressure. Just a little bit of pressure. These are very delicate parts. Next we'll do the third contact point and the fourth contact point. Next, we can add the circular support piece in place. Next, we can add the other short side piece. And with that, our tower lattice is complete. Let's take a moment and glue together our launch escape system nozzle halves. We'll be using our Plastruct Plastic Weld for this step. After just a little bit of sanding, we can bring the 2 LES nozzle components together. Next, let's put together the bases for our RCS quads. Again, just a little bit of sanding and we're ready to move forward. Let's get these parts ready to paint. We'll start by wiping them all down with a tack cloth. Next, we'll add some tape to the shoulders of the nose cones. Next, we'll attach everything to handling sticks so that we can prime and paint these parts. Our capsule, tower, and RCS parts are ready to be primed with 2 coats of Tamiya white primer applied about 7 to 10 minutes apart. After the primer cures for a couple of hours, everything is sanded with 1000 grit sanding film. And after that, everything gets a quick pass with a tack cloth. Next, we can apply 3 coats of Tamiya Pure White spray lacquer, again allowing 7 to 10 minutes between each coat. We can now spray the LES skirt and nozzles with black lacquer. Let's turn our attention back to the airframe tube. Now, our primer has dried and it's time to sand off most of that. We're going to be doing that with 400, 600, and 800 grit paper. Now, most of this I will do outside because this makes an absolute mess here, but I'll show you just the basics here. Again, this is 400 grit paper we're starting with. Note how the color changes a bit as we sand off that top layer of primer. I'll take this outside to continue with it. We can also sand the launch escape system tube as well. Again, 400, 600, and 800 grit paper. After sanding the high solids primer and wiping the airframe and LES motor down with a tack cloth, we can spray both with Tamiya white primer. After the Tamiya primer dries, we can paint the tube parts. I did 4 coats on each here, with each coat separated by about 7 to 10 minutes. It's now time to apply our vacuform wrap. This is the step that usually has the highest pucker factor, but if we plan and prepare well, we can complete this successfully with a minimum of drama. We'll be using 3M High Strength 90 spray adhesive for this step. You can purchase this at your local Lowe's or Home Depot. This is a sprayable contact cement, and it's both easy to use and effective. We'll need to draw a vertical reference line onto the lower portion of the airframe tube, just like it's described in the assembly instructions. Now, if we were to simply apply the wrap to the airframe, there would be a gap at the aft end of the tube. Fortunately, the kit includes a spacer to help fill that gap. On the other hand, the spacer is slightly too thick. There's an easy way to fix that though. We'll start by gluing the spacer in place with Titebond 2 and allowing it to dry. After the adhesive is dry, we can use the tip of a fresh X-Acto blade to tease away the upper layer of the spacer from the underlying layers and then peeling it away. We can then check the fit of the vacuform wrap against the spacer. If the fit works, you're done. If not, simply peel another thin layer of the spacer away. Let's go ahead and apply our vacuform wrap. We'll start by masking off the upper primed section of our airframe tube, and we'll also protect the interior surface of the tube with some printer paper. The surface of our workbench has been covered with paper to protect it from glue overspray. The important thing to note about the 3M High Strength 90 adhesive is that it is not paint. Let's spray some out on some paper here. It goes on in a lace-like pattern, almost like a splatter. That's normal, so resist the urge to spray more than a single layer. We're going to apply the adhesive to both the airframe tube and the inside surface of the vacuform wrap, and then we're going to let that dry for about 7 to 10 minutes. Our vacuform wrap has been taped to the paper with the inside surface facing up. Let's go ahead and apply the material. That's all it takes. Note this lace-like pattern. Again, this is not at all like paint. Next, we can apply the adhesive to the airframe tube. So, how will you know when the adhesive is ready? Just stick a knuckle down into it, and when it comes up cleanly, you're ready to proceed. Using the reference line we drew earlier as a starting point, we can slowly apply the wrap to the tube, bringing the ends of the wrap together. We'll apply a few pieces of tape to the seam and allow the adhesive to cure for a few hours. There's yet another bag of injection molded parts included with the kit, and this sprue contains parts that will apply to the vacuform wrap. It's just a simple matter of snipping them from the sprue and then cleaning them up with sanding sticks. The kit instructions contain a very comprehensive guide for applying these parts to the airframe. Now that when you do apply them, I suggest that you use Plastrex plastic weld cement for applying them. Be aware though that the vacuform wrap is very thin, so you'll want to use this sparingly. You may also find it easier to use a paintbrush to apply the glue. This long cable raceway part extends the entire length of the vacuform wrap. It actually trails off the aft edge just a little bit. In a stroke of genius, the kit designer planned for this to go over the exposed seam on the wrap, which saves us from the drudgery of having to clean that gap up. We'll glue this in place right here. And the corrugations in the wrap will actually help you keep everything lined up. It's time to put the last of the details on the airframe. I've got pencil marks on the lower airframe where each of these details need to go. Just a simple matter of applying some adhesive to the back and then applying that onto the airframe. Let's put some paint on our wrap. We'll be using the same process that we used for our fins, putting down a base of black and then overcoating that with the gloss aluminum color. 2 light coats of the black are used, allowing about 7 minutes between each coat. We can then move immediately onto the gloss aluminum lacquer, again allowing 7 minutes between each of the 3 coats. Let's put some decals on our model. This is always my favorite part of the process, as it seems that this is the point where the model really starts to come alive. We'll start with the capsule and LES motor sections. Now, our instructions have got a great guide showing where each of the markings need to go on the various components. Now, you may have noticed that we haven't brought any of our painted components together yet. There's a very good reason for that, as I find that decal application is far, far easier to do while everything is still in individual components. On our capsule and tower, for instance, we'll apply the decals, let them dry, and then we can bring everything together. We have a bowl of lukewarm water here to which I've added 1 single drop of dishwashing soap.
5 is right out.
The soap cuts the surface tension of the water, which allows everything to flow easier. We'll also be using a product called Microset, which is a mild acetic acid designed to help improve decal adhesion. We'll simply wet the surface onto which the decal will be applied just before we slide it into place. We'll start with the LES motor tube decal. Now, if we were to try to put this on in one piece, wrapping it around that would yield nothing but sadness. So we're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is cut each of the individual squares out and apply them individually. We'll also apply these 2 motor nozzle details as a separate decal. So let's go ahead and cut this out. And with that, we have 4 squares to install, plus the simulated motor nozzles. We'll take our first rectangle, put it in the water, and then take some Microset and paint it onto the surface of the tube. And we'll allow that to dry for a few minutes before we put the next rectangle in place. And with that, our LES motor is complete. Let's move on to the capsule decals. I've already trimmed them down to size. There are also some very handy hash marks that will help guide the application of the first marking, which is going to be the 3-element roll pattern. With that in place, it's a simple matter to place the remaining 3 roll pattern bits 90 degrees away from each other around the capsule. The kit also includes a pair of these US flag, United States lockup markings. Now there's a catch to this. There were 5 different Little Joe 2 vehicles, and each of them had different markings. Straight out of the box, the rounds that our Estes kit most closely resembles are the A003 and A004 rounds, neither of which had these markings. So be aware that adding them will not be strictly accurate, although they will add a neat flash of color to your model. We can now bring all of our tower components together, which will complete the pointy end of our model. We'll be using 5-minute epoxy for the plastic to paper joints between the LES motor, cone, and skirt, and then we'll be using plastic weld for all of the plastic to plastic joints. Also note that we're going to be adding clay nose weight to the interior of the LES motor tube. This is absolutely critical for flight stability. We can add the remaining clay weight to the inside of the capsule. And finally, we can add the LES motor to the top of the tower lattice. Note that the topmost rectangular roll pattern feature on the tower aligns with the longest roll pattern feature on the capsule. And with that, our tower is finished. We're now ready to add the United States decals to our airframe. These will be installed on the 2 opposite sides of the airframe that lack the cable raceway details. They'll be centered between the fin alignment pads and above this detail. Now the decal will be positioned with the bottom of the second T in states at the base of this circumferential detail right here. Now, because of the irregular surface of the airframe wrap corrugations, we'll be adding a second decal goo to the process. We'll still prepare the model surface with microset and then apply the decal. After that, we'll apply a product called microsol on top. The microsol will soften the decal and allow it to conform with the irregular corrugation surface. Let's drop the decal into the water. Again, we're using a soft paintbrush to apply the microset. That's the blue labeled bottle to the corrugations. We'll apply the decal and gently push the center down into the corrugations. We'll then apply the microsol, that's the red bottle, over the top and leave everything alone to dry. The microsol will soften the decal, and as the water evaporates, the marking will begin to conform with the surface of the model. It may take a couple of application and dry cycles for the process to work, but it will eventually work. We'll move on to the upper section of the airframe next. Much like our LES decals, attempting to place these markings on the model in a single piece would likely result in a remarkable display of profanity, followed by a brief flight of our model into the nearest trash can. We obviously want to avoid that outcome, so we're going to cut this decal sheet up into smaller, easier to install bits of decal. We'll start by making a couple paper copies of the decal sheet to help with placement and alignment, then cutting out the sections of the decal sheet. We now have everything segmented out and ready to go on the model. Using our kit instructions and the copies of the decal we made as guides, we can begin installation of the markings. We'll be using microset again to prepare the surface, but we won't need the decal solvent as these are all going onto a glossy, smooth surface. These markings simulate a series of fasteners and vent holes that ring the lower edge of the service module portion of our model. Like the roll pattern markings, we've cut these up into more manageable portions. We now have everything assembled, painted, and decaled, and we're at the point where we can bring everything together. We'll start by installing our motor mount into the airframe using 5-minute epoxy. The proper alignment will place 2 of the simulated motor nozzles in line with the 2 United States markings on the airframe. We can now glue our fins in place using 5-minute epoxy. Let's assemble our RCS quads. I've drilled a small hole in the back of each quad and glued a length of 040 styrene rod into each hole. Next, we'll use this spiffy little tool to apply a drop of CA onto each of the nozzles and to mount them onto the base. Now, this won't show up on camera very well, but the tool is a sewing needle with 1/2 of the eye cut off and then mounted into a pin vise. This allows us to use it to pick up a drop of glue from a small puddle and drop it into place on the part. We've chopped up one of the copies of the upper airframe decals to create a template for installation of our RCS quads. An awl is used to mark the center of each location, then a hole is drilled on that spot. A single dot of medium CA glue on the back is then used to mount each quad, threading the styrene rod through the hole. Once everything cures, the excess rod can be clipped off on the inside of the tube. This should significantly lower the possibility of these tiny parts disappearing due to either flight damage or hanger rash. At this point, it's a simple matter of placing the capsule atop the airframe, and our model is complete. The correct alignment is to place the long segment of the roll pattern on the capsule in line with the RCS quad on the side of the booster with the 2-segment roll pattern. I'd like to send a shout out to my dear friend Steve Crystal, who provided the kit used in this build. Thanks for watching, and I certainly hope that this presentation will inspire all of you to go grab a kit from your build pile and get to work.